The hallway smelled of damp concrete and old grease, but the 5-year-old boy didn't notice the scent. He was focused on the heavy, rhythmic pounding against the front door. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor. Before anyone could move, the wood frame splintered. Men in tactical gear swarmed the small apartment in Chicago's South Side, their boots heavy on the floorboard. Dwyane Wade Jr. looked up to find the barrel of a service weapon leveled at his forehead. The officer didn't see a child. He saw a lead. He shouted, demanding to know where Jolinda was. The boy remained silent, paralyzed by the red laser dot dancing across his skin, while his mother, a woman consumed by the trade and use of heroin and cocaine, was the target of the raid. The officers tore the apartment apart, flipping mattresses and emptying cabinets, looking for the needles and bags they knew were there. They left as quickly as they arrived, leaving a shattered door and a boy who now understood that home was not a place of safety, but a target. This moment stripped away the shielding of childhood, replacing curiosity with a permanent, scanning state of hypervigilance. Long before the police raids became a routine, the boy's life had already fractured. His parents, Jolinda and Dwyane Sr., ended their marriage when he was only 4 months old. A clerical error on his birth certificate had already marked him as Dwyane instead of the intended Dwayne, a small, permanent glitch in his identity. He lived with his mother and his older sister, Tragil, in a rotating series of apartments across some of the most violent blocks in Chicago. Eviction notices were as common as junk mail. They moved from one crumbling building to another, often hauling their belongings in trash bags under the cover of night. Jolinda's struggle with addiction turned their living rooms into revolving doors for the neighborhood's drug trade. Wade watched as his mother's health declined, her eyes growing hollow as the substances took hold. He learned to navigate around the paraphernalia left on the kitchen table and the strangers who drifted in and out of their lives. In this environment, survival meant being invisible. He became an expert at reading the tension in a room before a single word was spoken. Violence wasn't just something that happened inside the apartment. It was the soundtrack of the South Side streets. Wade stood by the window often, watching the corner where local gangs patrolled their territory. One afternoon, he looked out to see a body lying motionless on the pavement, surrounded by the casual indifference of a city that had seen too much. He saw his mother being led away in handcuffs more than once, her head bowed as the squad car doors slammed shut. Each time she went to prison, the silence in the apartment became heavy. Without her, the thin structure of their lives collapsed further. He stopped expecting meals to be on time or the lights to stay on. He began to associate the sound of sirens not with help, but with the disappearance of his primary caregiver. This exposure to systemic chaos forced a 5-year-old to develop an emotional callousness usually reserved for soldiers. He didn't cry when the sirens faded. He simply waited for the next shift in the wind. Dwyane Wade saw what the environment was doing to her younger brother. While their mother was trapped in a cycle of arrest and relapse, Tragil took on the role of the protector. She was the one who made sure Dwyane ate, even if it was just a slice of bread. She was the one who shielded his eyes when the street grew too bloody. By the time Dwyane turned 8, the situation had reached a breaking point. The apartment was a shell, and Jolinda's addiction had stripped away any semblance of a home. Tragil realized that if Dwyane stayed, he would eventually be consumed by the same streets that were claiming their mother. She reached out to their father, Dwyane Sr., who was living in Robbins, a nearby suburb that offered a different kind of life. He was a veteran and a printer, a man who lived by a clock and a set of rules. Tragil didn't tell Dwyane the truth about what was happening. She told him they were going to the movies. It was a rare treat, a chance to escape the gray walls of the South Side for a few hours. The boy put on his best clothes, excited for a day out with his sister. They walked away from the apartment, leaving behind the smell of the hallway and the memory of the red laser dot. They boarded a bus, but they didn't stop at a theater. Instead, they traveled toward the outskirts of the city, where the buildings were shorter and the air felt thinner. When the bus stopped, Dwyane Sr. was waiting. Traggle handed over a small bag of her brother's belongings. She told Dwyane he would be staying here for a while. The boy realized then that the movie wasn't happening. His sister, the only constant in his life, was turning back toward the city. He stood on the sidewalk in Robbins, watching her walk away. He felt the sudden, sharp sting of abandonment, unaware that this deception was the most significant act of love he would ever experience. Dwyane Sr.'s house was different. There were no needles in the corners and no strangers in the kitchen. The air was quiet. His father didn't offer many words of comfort. He offered a schedule. There was a time to wake up, a time to eat, and a time to work. For a boy who had spent 8 years navigating a chaotic abyss, this new rigidity felt like a foreign language. He missed his mother's voice, even the versions of it distorted by drugs. He felt like an intruder in this stable world. However, in the backyard of the house in Robbins, there was a patch of dirt and a rusted hoop. On his first evening there, Dwyane picked up a basketball. He dribbled it against the uneven ground, the rhythmic thud, 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 replacing the sound of the pounding at the door. He threw the ball toward the rim. It missed, bouncing into the weeds, but he chased it down. He did it again. For the first time in his life, he was the one in control of the movement. He wasn't waiting for a raid or an eviction. He was just a boy with a ball, and the South Side was finally behind him. The concrete in Robbins was unforgiving, radiating heat in the summer and turning into a slab of ice by November. Dwyane Sr. didn't believe in the luxury of high-end sneakers for a boy who hadn't yet proven he could handle the basics. He often made his son play barefoot on the rough pavement. The boy's skin tore, then blistered, and eventually thickened into a layer of leather that felt nothing. If Dwyane complained about the pain or the exhaustion of the 3-hour drills, the session simply lasted longer. His father, a man defined by the rigid structures of the military and the factory floor, viewed basketball not as a game, but as a survival kit. He demanded perfection in every chest pass and every defensive slide. There were no participation trophies in the driveway. There was only the repetitive, bone-deep fatigue of doing it until it was right. This relentless environment stripped away the soft edges of the boy who had fled the South Side, replacing fear with a cold, calculated work ethic. Life inside the house in Robbins was a stark contrast to the lawless uncertainty of his mother's apartment. Dwyane Sr. enforced a strict code. Chores were non-negotiable, grades were the baseline, and respect was the currency. The boy shared this space with a step-brother and a step-sister, forming a blended family that functioned like a small platoon. Hunger was a frequent guest, not because of neglect, but because resources were tight. Dwyane learned to ignore the growl in his stomach, focusing instead on the next drill or the next chore. He watched his father work long shifts at the printing plant, coming home with ink-stained hands, only to head straight to the court to push his son further. This witnessed sacrifice created a silent pact between them. Dwyane realized that his father wasn't just teaching him how to shoot a ball. He was teaching him how to build a fortress against a world that had already tried to break him. By the time he was 12, the boy had found his North Star in the form of Michael Jordan. The Chicago Bulls were the dominant force in the world, and Jordan was the architect of that dominance. Dwyane watched every game he could, memorizing the way Jordan pivoted, the way he breathed during free throws, and the way he hunted for every loose ball. In the Robbins driveway, Dwyane would narrate his own games, imagining he was under the lights of the United Center instead of a dim street lamp. He began to see basketball as a vehicle for departure. He noted that while his friends were drifting toward the fringes of local street life, the ball kept him centered. He made a conscious decision to avoid the corners and the easy money that had destroyed his mother's life. Every missed shot became a personal insult, and every successful drive was a step closer to a life that didn't involve eviction notices. The training sessions grew more intense as the boy entered his early teens. Dwyane Sr. would often play defense himself, using his superior size and veteran toughness to knock his son to the ground. He wouldn't offer a hand to help him up. He waited to see if the boy would find his own footing. Dwyane learned to use his lower center of gravity to bump back, finding ways to score against a man who refused to give an inch. He developed a mid-range jumper that was born out of the necessity to score before he got hit. His father's refusal to praise him served as a powerful, if bitter, fuel. He didn't play for a pat on the back. He played to eliminate any reason for criticism. This shift from seeking approval to seeking flawlessness became the foundation of his competitive identity. As the 14th year of his life approached, the transition from child to athlete was complete. The soft-spoken boy who had arrived in Robbins with a trash bag of clothes was gone. In his place was a teenager with a quiet, observant intensity and a body that was beginning to catch up to his ambitions. He still thought about his mother, but the pain had moved from the front of his mind to the background, replaced by the mechanical repetition of the game. He had internalized his father's belief that discipline was the only true defense against the chaos of the world. He stood on the edge of high school, looking at the varsity rafters, not with hope, but with a predatory focus. Basketball was no longer just a hobby or an escape. It was the only way out, and he was prepared to outwork anyone who stood in the path of that exit. The list on the gymnasium door was a finality that Dwyane couldn't blink away. As a freshman at Harold L. Richards High School, he stood barely 5'9", a height that made him invisible among the giants patrolling the varsity lanes. He watched his name stay relegated to the junior varsity roster, a devastating blow for a kid who had built his entire identity on the Robbins pavement. While the stars of the school practiced under the main lights, Dwyane was sent to the side gym, grinding through obscure drills in front of empty bleachers. His grades were equally problematic, trailing far behind his athletic output as he struggled to find interest in anything that didn't involve a whistle. He spent his nights staring at the ceiling, gripped by the fear that he was just another neighborhood kid with a dream that had reached its ceiling too early. This period of rejection forced him to develop a specialized kind of patience, turning his internal frustration into a quiet, simmering energy that waited for a crack in the door. Between his freshman and sophomore years, the boy's DNA finally caught up to his ambition. He woke up one morning to find his clothes fitting like rags and his joints aching with the strain of a 4-inch growth spurt. By the time he walked back into the Richards gym, he was a 6'1" guard with the wingspan of a much larger man. The speed he had developed to survive as a small guard didn't disappear. It combined with his new height to create a violent, explosive first step. He also split his time on the football field, playing wide receiver with a style that treated every pass as a life-or-death struggle. He learned how to high-point a ball over defenders and how to take a hit without losing his grip, skills that would soon translate into a unique, contact-heavy basketball style. The football field became his laboratory for toughness, proving that he could be the hammer rather than the nail. Despite his physical gifts, Coach Jack Fitzgerald noticed a glaring weakness. Dwyane was too reliant on the rim. In a move that felt like a punishment, Fitzgerald instituted a no-layups rule during specific team scrimmages. Any point Dwyane scored within 5 feet of the basket was immediately wiped off the scoreboard. If he wanted to stay on the floor, he had to shoot from the perimeter. Dwyane spent hours in the corner of the gym, hoisting mid-range jumpers until his shoulders burned, forced to evolve from a one-dimensional slasher into a genuine scoring threat. The result was a senior season that shattered school records. He averaged 27 points and 11 rebounds a game, leading Richards to a 24-5 record and turning the local South Suburban Conference into his personal highlight reel. This forced evolution destroyed his comfort zone, ensuring that his game wouldn't collapse when elite defenders eventually took away the paint. Even with a record-breaking senior year, the elite gatekeepers of college basketball remained unimpressed. While names like LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony were already being groomed for the pros, Dwyane's mailbox remained conspicuously light. He wasn't invited to the prestigious ABCD camps. He wasn't a McDonald's All-American. And he wasn't on the radar of the blue blood programs like Duke or North Carolina. Most recruiters looked at his poor academic standing and his undersized frame for a shooting guard and moved on to the next prospect. He watched as lesser players received full-ride offers to national powerhouses while he waited for a phone call that wouldn't come. This lack of recognition reinforced a deep-seated us against the world mentality. He realized that no matter how much he achieved, the establishment would always look for a reason to count him out. In the end, the recruitment process was less of a coronation and more of a desperate search for a chance. He eventually caught the eye of Tom Crean, an assistant coach at Marquette University, who saw a raw, unpolished intensity that others had mistaken for a lack of skill. Marquette wasn't the glitz of the ACC or the Big Ten at the time, but it was a path. Dwyane signed his letter of intent with a chip on his shoulder that had become permanent. He left Richards High School not as a celebrated prodigy, but as an overlooked underdog with everything to prove. He wasn't looking for a college education. He was looking for a stage where he could finally punish the people who had left him off the list. The roar of the Bradley Center felt miles away, even though Dwyane was sitting right in the middle of it. Because of his low SAT scores, the NCAA had declared him academically ineligible under Proposition 48. He wasn't allowed to suit up, travel with the team, or even practice in the main gym. Instead of leading the fast break, the 20-year-old was forced to sit on the end of the bench in a cheap suit, clutching a clipboard like a shield. He spent every home game scribbling notes, tracking every defensive rotation and every missed box out. While his teammates played for the crowd, Dwyane was forced to become a student of the game's skeletal structure. This forced exile stripped away his ego, turning a raw athlete into a cerebral tactician who saw the game 3 plays ahead of everyone else. When he finally earned the right to step onto the floor for his sophomore season, the momentum came to a sickening halt in a quiet practice facility. During a routine drill, his left knee buckled. The sound was a dull pop, followed by a searing heat that radiated from the joint. The diagnosis was a torn meniscus. The doctors gave him 2 options: repair the cartilage and sit out for months, likely ending his season and cooling his NBA prospects, or simply cut the damaged piece out. Removing it would get him back on the court in weeks, but it would leave the bones to grind against each other for the rest of his life. Wade didn't hesitate. He chose the removal. He was a young man from the South Side who had nothing but his mobility, and he was willing to trade his future mobility for a present chance. This decision was a cold-blooded gamble, a sign that he valued his immediate window of opportunity more than his long-term physical health. The result of the surgery was an immediate, terrifying explosion of talent. With no meniscus to cushion the blow, Wade played as if he were trying to outrun his own shadow. During his sophomore year, he averaged nearly 18 points a game, leading Marquette back into the national conversation. By his junior year, he had become an unsolvable puzzle for opposing coaches. He wasn't just fast. He was heavy on the move, using his football-honed strength to bounce off defenders while maintaining his balance. He swept the Conference USA Player of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year awards, proving he was as dangerous at the rim as he was in the passing lanes. His game had become a high-speed collision of skill and desperation, fueled by the knowledge that every jump landing was a withdrawal from a finite bank of health. The climax of his college career arrived on a Saturday in Minneapolis during the 2003 Elite Eight. Marquette was facing the top-seeded Kentucky Wildcats, a blue blood program stacked with future pros. The world expected Kentucky to coast, but Wade turned the court into his private theater. He grabbed defensive rebounds and ignited the break himself, either finishing with a violent dunk or finding open teammates with no-look passes that froze the defense. He finished the game with 29 points, 11 rebounds, and 11 assists, a triple-double that shook the foundations of college basketball. Marquette dismantled Kentucky 83-69, punching their first ticket to the Final Four since 1977. This performance wasn't just a win. It was a loud, undeniable declaration to the NBA scouts in the rafters that the kid from the South Side had arrived. By the time the Final Four run ended, Wade's stock had vaulted into the stratosphere. He had transformed from a Prop 48 casualty into a consensus first-team All-American. Off the court, his life was also stabilizing. His mother, Jolinda, had finally begun her journey into sobriety, starting the slow process of mending their fractured relationship. In April 2003, Wade officially declared for the NBA draft. Bypassing his senior year, he left Marquette as a legend, but he carried a heavy secret beneath his skin. His left knee was now a ticking clock, a joint without a shock absorber that would eventually demand its payment in full. He had successfully gambled his body for a seat at the table. And now, the world was waiting to see what he would do with the time he had bought. The spotlight in the Madison Square Garden Theater was blinding, but Dwyane felt like a ghost in the room. It was the 2003 NBA Draft, a night dominated by the shadow of LeBron James and the scoring hype of Carmelo Anthony. When the Miami Heat called his name at number 5, the reaction was a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Most scouts doubted a 6'4" guard with a surgically altered knee could survive the grind of an 82-game season. Wade walked onto the stage, shook David Stern's hand, and accepted a jersey for a team that had just finished a dismal 25-win season. He didn't offer a flashy quote. He simply went to South Beach and began dismantling veteran defenders with a first step that looked like a glitch in the game's physics. By the end of his rookie year, Miami had surged to 42 wins and a second-round playoff appearance. This immediate impact silenced the draft night critics, proving that while others had the hype, Wade had the most efficient engine in the class. The trajectory of the franchise shifted violently in the summer of 2004, when a private jet landed in Miami carrying Shaquille O'Neal. The most dominant force in basketball had left Los Angeles with a singular mission: to prove he could win without Kobe Bryant. Shaq looked at the young guard and saw a weapon he could sharpen. He dubbed the kid Flash, a nod to his ability to vanish from the perimeter and reappear at the rim before the defense could rotate. Instead of a power struggle, the two formed a predatory partnership. Shaq provided the gravity in the paint, while Wade operated in the spaces left behind, averaging over 24 points a game. They pushed the Heat to the Eastern Conference Finals in their first year together, falling just short of a title. This season was the forge where Wade's identity as a closer was hammered into shape, moving him from a rising star to a top-tier lieutenant in a championship army. The ultimate test arrived in June 2006. The Miami Heat were in the NBA Finals for the first time in history, facing a disciplined Dallas Mavericks team. After 2 games in Texas, Miami was down 0-2, and the narrative was already written. Wade was too young, and Shaq was too old. In the locker room before Game 3, the atmosphere was funeral quiet. Wade looked at the championship trophy that had been brought into the arena for the Mavericks to admire and decided the script needed to change. He began attacking the basket with a reckless disregard for his own safety, drawing fouls and converting circus shots that defied gravity. He dropped 42 points and 13 rebounds in Game 3, sparking a frantic comeback that saved the season. This wasn't a tactical victory. It was a sheer act of will that broke the Mavericks' momentum and forced the series into a dogfight. Over the next 3 games, Wade produced one of the most statistically dominant stretches in finals history. He averaged 39.2 points over the final 4 contests, treating the Dallas defense like a revolving door. In the clinching Game 6, with the weight of the city on his shoulders, he poured in 36 points and grabbed 10 boards. When the final buzzer sounded, Wade tossed the ball high into the rafters of the American Airlines Center. He was named the Finals MVP, the 5th youngest player to ever receive the honor. He had delivered Miami its first championship, not by playing around the defense, but by going through it. This performance elevated him into a different stratosphere of fame, turning Flash into a global brand and cementing his place as the premier shooting guard in the league. While the basketball world celebrated his rise, a quieter, more profound victory was taking place in his personal life. His mother, Jolinda, had reached a milestone in her sobriety, finally emerging from the darkness of her addiction to become a licensed minister. Wade, who had spent his childhood watching her being led away in handcuffs, now watched her lead a congregation. In an act of total restoration, he purchased a church for her in Chicago, a physical symbol that the cycle of trauma had been broken. He carried the key to that church with him, a reminder that his success on the court was merely a tool to rebuild his family. He was now a world champion, a father to his young son, Zaire, and a husband to his high school sweetheart, Siobhan. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of on the Robbins pavement, but the missing meniscus in his left knee was beginning to send its first quiet signals of distress. He was at the absolute peak of the mountain, unaware that the descent into a multi-year injury hell was only months away. The ticker tape from the 2004 parade was barely swept away before the bill for Dwyane's physical style of play came due. By 27, the explosive first step that had decimated Dallas was replaced by a visible limp. During a game in Houston, his left shoulder popped out of its socket, a dislocation so severe it required he be wheeled off the floor. In the training room, the doctors delivered a double blow. The shoulder needed a total reconstruction, and the left knee, the one without a meniscus, was now a disaster of frayed cartilage and bone-on-bone friction. Wade underwent a grueling double surgery in May 2007, effectively ending his season and leaving the Miami Heat in a tailspin. While he was immobilized in a hospital bed, his team collapsed into a franchise-worst 15-win season, the worst record in the NBA. This period of forced stillness was a psychological cage for a player defined by speed, forcing him to confront the reality that his body was failing him at 25. Rehabilitation was not a graceful process. It was a dark, repetitive grind that started while the rest of Miami was still asleep. Wade was in the gym by 4 in the morning, performing tedious isometric exercises to wake up the muscles that had withered during surgery. He had to relearn how to land, how to pivot, and how to trust a knee that sent sharp, electric jolts of pain through his leg with every jump. During this same window, his personal life was fracturing as publicly as his health. He entered a bitter, multi-year divorce and custody battle with his high school sweetheart, Siobhan, a conflict that played out in tabloids and courtrooms. Wade retreated into the gym, using the physical pain of rehab to drown out the emotional noise of the legal proceedings. This isolation transformed him from a flashy superstar into a hardened professional, one who viewed the basketball court as the only place where he still held total control. The world got its first look at the new Wade during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Skeptics wondered if the injuries had permanently robbed him of his elite athleticism. But Wade answered by becoming the leading scorer for the legendary Redeem team. Coming off the bench, he shot a staggering 67% from the field, providing a violent energy that helped the U.S. reclaim the gold medal. When he returned to the NBA for the 28-9 season, he wasn't just healthy, he was possessed. He played with a predatory intensity, knowing his window was finite. He averaged a career-high 30.2 points per game, snatching the league scoring title away from the favorite. He wasn't just scoring. He was putting on a nightly clinic of mid-range mastery and defensive disruption, leading the league in highlight reel blocks for a guard. This season was a defiant statement to the basketball establishment that the Flash era wasn't over. It had merely evolved into something more lethal and calculated. The defining moment of this individual peak occurred in March 2009 against his hometown Chicago Bulls. With the game tied in double overtime, Wade intercepted a pass and sprinted the length of the floor, launching an improbable running three-pointer at the buzzer. As the ball snapped the net, he didn't celebrate with his teammates. He jumped onto the scorer's table, pointed to the hardwood beneath his feet, and screamed, "This is my house!" A few weeks later, he dismantled the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden for a career-high 55 points. Despite these historic performances, the Heat remained a middle-of-the-pack team, unable to provide Wade with a supporting cast that could match his output. He was carrying an entire franchise on a knee that required constant icing and manual draining of fluid. This individual dominance was a double-edged sword, proving his greatness while simultaneously accelerating the wear on his joints. As the 2010 season approached, the toll of playing above the rim without a shock absorber was becoming undeniable. His medical staff noted that the cartilage in his knee was wearing down at 3 times the rate of a normal athlete. Every explosive drive to the basket was a withdrawal from a bank account that was rapidly approaching zero. Wade finished the decade as an all-star MVP and a perennial All-NBA selection, but he was tired of being a lonely king. He had proved he could lead the league in scoring and carry a team on his back. But the memories of the 2006 championship were fading. He realized that if he wanted to win again before his legs gave out completely, he would have to do something radical. He began looking toward the free agent class of 2010, ready to trade his individual statistics for a chance to share the burden of greatness. The secret meetings in the summer of 2010 weren't about money. They were about survival. Dwyane knew his individual peak was a finite resource, and his left knee was already beginning to send distress signals. He reached out to LeBron James and Chris Bosh, convincing them to converge on Miami. To make the math work for the Heat's front office, Wade took a significant pay cut, leaving millions on the table to ensure the roster had depth. He understood that to win another championship, he had to stop being the sun and start being a planet in a larger system. This decision was a calculated surrender of his alpha status, a move that stunned the league and turned the Miami Heat into the most hated team in sports. It was a trade-off that prioritized a trophy cabinet over a scoring title, marking the beginning of a 4-year window where every game was a referendum on his legacy. The first year of the experiment ended in a disaster that forced Wade to look in the mirror. During the 2011 finals against the Dallas Mavericks, the chemistry between the Big Three fractured under the pressure of the moment. While Wade performed at an elite level, The team lacked a clear hierarchy, and they watched as Dirk Nowitzki celebrated on their home floor. In the off-season, Wade flew to Akron to meet with LeBron. He told his friend, "This is your team now." He intentionally changed his game, cutting more without the ball, focusing on transition defense, and becoming the league's most dangerous secondary option. This ego death was the catalyst for the 2011-12 season, transforming the Heat from a collection of stars into a cohesive, terrifying machine. As the team surged toward a title in 2012, Wade's physical reality became a horror show behind closed doors. His left knee was constantly inflamed, filled with a thick, amber-colored fluid that made it look twice the size of his right. Before playoff games against the Indiana Pacers and the Oklahoma City Thunder, Wade sat on a trainer's table while a medical professional inserted a long needle into the joint to drain the excess liquid. He would walk out of the training room with a bandage over the puncture site and drop 30 points. In the 2012 finals, he averaged 22.6 points and 5.2 assists, helping LeBron secure his first ring. This blood and fluid basketball was a testament to his threshold for pain, proving that he was willing to grind his bones into dust for the sake of the collective goal. The 2013 championship run was even more grueling. By the time the Heat reached Game 7 of the finals against the San Antonio Spurs, Wade's legs were essentially shot. He had spent the entire season managing his minutes, playing a game of chicken with his own health. On that final night in June, he produced 23 points and 10 rebounds, diving for loose balls and hitting mid-range jumpers that kept the Spurs' defense off balance. When the final buzzer sounded on their back-to-back titles, he sat on the locker room floor and poured champagne over his knees, a silent acknowledgement of the price they had paid. This win solidified his place as a three-time champion, but it was clear to everyone in the building that he was running on fumes. Away from the arena, the chaos of his early career finally gave way to a hard-won stability. In 2011, after a long and public legal battle, he officially finalized his divorce and was granted primary physical custody of his two sons, Zaire and Zion. He also found a new partnership with actress Gabrielle Union, providing a support system that balanced the high-stakes pressure of the Heat dynasty. However, the physical toll had reached a tipping point. By the 2014 finals, the Heat were dismantled by a vengeful Spurs team, and the Big Three era crumbled. LeBron returned to Cleveland, Bosh began dealing with health scares, and Wade was left in a quiet locker room in Miami. He was 32 years old, 3 rings heavier, and physically spent, standing at the beginning of a final uncertain chapter in a jersey he had sacrificed everything to wear. The air in the Miami Heat front office turned cold in the summer of 2016. After 13 years of carrying the franchise, taking pay cuts, and sacrificing his knees for 3 championship banners, Dwyane expected a legacy contract that acknowledged his worth. Instead, Pat Riley offered a deal that felt like a placeholder. The negotiations stalled, then fractured into a public stalemate. Wade, feeling undervalued by the man who had been his professional architect, made a phone call that shocked the league. He signed a 2-year, $47 million deal with the Chicago Bulls. He walked away from the only professional home he had ever known, leaving behind a confused fan base and a bridge that appeared to be burning. This departure was a calculated act of self-respect, proving that even a franchise icon would rather be a nomad than a discounted employee. Playing in a Bulls jersey felt like a costume for a movie that didn't have a script. While he was back in his hometown, the physical reality was grueling. His Achilles tendons were chronically inflamed, and the absence of a shock-absorbing meniscus meant every game was followed by hours of ice and electrical stimulation. The Bulls were a team in transition, lacking the defensive identity Wade had spent a decade building in Miami. He averaged 18 3-points, but the explosive flash was gone, replaced by a veteran who had to rely on pump fakes and high-post footwork to survive. During this time, his personal life expanded as he married Gabrielle Union, creating a blended family that became his primary sanctuary. He began publicly supporting his daughter Zaya's journey with her gender identity, applying the same fierce protection to his home life that he once applied to the paint. The wandering continued in 2017, when Wade reached a buyout with Chicago and signed a veteran minimum deal to join LeBron James in Cleveland. For the first time in his life, the three-time champion was asked to come off the bench. He accepted the role with a quiet professionalism, leading the second unit and providing a stabilizing presence for a chaotic Cavaliers roster. However, the spark was missing. A groin strain sidelined him for weeks, and the media began writing his professional obituary, claiming the game had finally outrun him. The low point came in early 2018 when his longtime agent and father figure, Henry Thomas, passed away. The grief stripped away the armor Wade had worn during his contract disputes, leaving him raw and reflective about the bridges he had burned. At Henry Thomas's funeral, the basketball world gathered in a somber truce. Wade looked across the room and saw Pat Riley. The two men, who hadn't spoken since the 2016 fallout, walked toward each other and shared a long, silent embrace. There were no lawyers or spreadsheets between them, just the shared history of two men who had won the world together. A few weeks later, at the trade deadline in February 2018, the Cavaliers sent Wade back to the Miami Heat for a heavily protected second-round pick, essentially a gift to let him go home. When he stepped off the plane in South Florida, the tension of the last 2 years evaporated. This reconciliation was a rare moment of sentimentality in a cold industry, acknowledging that some bonds are more valuable than a salary cap. Wade's return to the American Airlines arena was an emotional lightning strike. In his first game back, coming off the bench against the Milwaukee Bucks, he blocked a shot and hit a clutch jumper that sent the crowd into a frenzy. He wasn't the focal point of the offense anymore, and he didn't need to be. He took on a mentorship role for young players like Bam Adebayo, teaching them the nuances of the Heat culture he had helped define. He was 36 years old, playing on legs that felt like they were made of glass, but he was back in the building where his jersey would eventually hang. He had survived the wandering, repaired the broken relationships, and earned the right to decide how his own story would end. The pre-game ritual in the Miami locker room was no longer about scouting reports. It was an act of medical engineering. For 40 minutes before every tip-off, Dwyane sat in a chair while trainers layered his left knee in specialized tape, neoprene sleeves, and a custom carbon fiber brace. His joints had reached a state of terminal wear, a bone-on-bone reality that he jokingly referred to as his mechanical exoskeleton. To compensate for the lack of a meniscus, his left shoe was custom-built 15 grams lighter than his right, featuring a rigid carbon plate and extreme arch support to keep his alignment from collapsing. He wasn't playing on a human leg anymore. He was playing on a managed injury. This grueling preparation was the silent price he paid for the one last dance, a season-long farewell that he announced to the world via a poignant social media video. It transformed his final year from a struggle for minutes into a victory lap, allowing him to control the terms of his own exit. As the Heat traveled from city to city, the hostility that usually greeted the 2006 champion evaporated into standing ovation. Wade turned every post-game center court into a summit, initiating a jersey exchange tradition that became the viral heartbeat of the NBA season. He swapped jerseys with future Hall of Famers like LeBron James and Dirk Nowitzki, but he also sought out younger stars like Donovan Mitchell and Devin Booker, passing the torch with a quiet word of advice. These moments weren't just for the cameras. They were a public acknowledgement of the respect he had earned through 16 years of physical sacrifice. The league, which had once feared his explosive first step, now paused to celebrate his longevity. This ritualized respect allowed Wade to transition from a polarizing competitor into a beloved elder statesman, smoothing the edges of a career defined by fierce friction. Despite the limitations of his exoskeleton, the statistical milestones continued to fall. During a midseason stretch, Wade became only the third player in NBA history to record 20,000 points, 5,000 assists, 4,000 rebounds, 15 steals, 800 blocks, and 500 three-pointers. He moved past Michael Jordan to become the all-time leader in blocks for a guard, finishing his career with 885 rejections. He wasn't hunting for shots anymore. He was hunting for moments of defensive brilliance that reminded the world why he was a perennial all-defensive selection. On a Tuesday night in February, he hit a leaning, one-legged three-pointer at the buzzer to stun the Golden State Warriors, a vintage flash moment that proved the fire hadn't been extinguished by the ice packs. This late career efficiency was a masterclass in adaptation, showing a player who had traded raw speed for an unrivaled understanding of angles and timing. The final act took place on April 10, 2019, at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. The arena was packed with fans in Miami jerseys, and his best friends, LeBron James, Chris Paul, and Carmelo Anthony, sat courtside to witness the end. Wade didn't coast through the game. He hunted for one last masterpiece. He operated in the mid-post, finding cutters with pinpoint passes and attacking the rim with a deliberate, measured pace. He finished the night with 25 points, 11 rebounds, and 10 assists, securing the fifth triple-double of his career in his very last professional game. When the final buzzer sounded, he walked to the sideline and shared a long, emotional embrace with his sons and his wife. This triple-double was a mathematical perfect ending, a final proof of a complete game that didn't need a meniscus to dominate one last time. In the locker room afterward, Wade sat in front of his locker and poured a bottle of expensive champagne over his knees. It was a gesture of gratitude and an apology to the joints that had carried him through 1,054 games of high-impact collision. He had walked into the league as a misspelled name from the South Side and walked out as one of the 75 greatest players to ever touch a basketball. The One Last Dance wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was a necessary bridge between the obsession of the game and the peace of retirement. He left the locker room for the last time with his head held high, the carbon fiber brace finally removed, ready to see who Dwyane Wade was without the ball. The transition from the hardwood to the boardroom happened with the same calculated speed that once defined his first step. Dwyane didn't drift into a quiet retirement. He pivoted into a multi-dimensional enterprise. He expanded his Way of Wade partnership with Li Ning, launched a successful wine label, and stepped into media production with his own podcast and documentaries like The Redeem Team. His jersey, the number 3 that had been a blur in the Miami Heat for 15 years, was hoisted to the rafters of the Cassia Center, and a stretch of 7th Street was officially renamed Dwyane Wade Boulevard. This shift from athlete to mogul was a deliberate construction of a legacy that didn't require a basketball. He was no longer just a scorer. He was a curator of culture, using his platform to advocate for LGBTQ rights and support his daughter Zaya with a public ferocity that challenged traditional athletic stereotypes. In 2023, The man who had survived a childhood of police raids and 16 years of bone-on-bone knee pain faced a silent internal threat. During a routine medical checkup, doctors discovered a 3-centimeter cancerous tumor on his right kidney. Wade didn't hide the diagnosis. He underwent immediate surgery to remove the mass, and then went public with his recovery. He used the experience to pivot his philanthropic focus toward health equity and cancer screening, turning a personal crisis into a public service announcement. This vulnerability was a final, mature evolution of the Flash persona. He proved that true toughness wasn't about playing through a sprained ankle, but about facing mortality with the same transparency he brought to the game. The emotional culmination of his 40-year journey took place on a stage in Springfield, Massachusetts, in August 2023. Dwyane stood before the basketball world as he was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. In a moment that broke from traditional protocol, he invited his father, Dwyane Sr., to join him at the podium. He looked at the man who had once forced him to practice barefoot on the Robbins pavement and told the crowd, "We're in the Hall of Fame, Pop." This shared induction was the ultimate closure for a family that had been fractured by the Chicago Abyss 4 decades earlier. It wasn't just an individual honor. It was a collective victory for a lineage that had successfully outrun its trauma. Today, Wade's life is a balanced map of mentorship and business. He spends his days advising his eldest son, Zaire, on the realities of professional basketball, offering the kind of guidance his own father provided, but tempered with the empathy of a man who has seen both sides of the curtain. He remains a fixture at Heat games, a part owner of the Utah Jazz, and a constant presence in the fashion and philanthropic worlds. The boy who was once pointed at with a police officer's gun now stands as one of the NBA's 75 greatest icons, his misspelled name a permanent fixture in the history books. He has moved beyond the need for a meniscus or a championship ring to define him. He has achieved the rarest form of success. He outlasted his environment, survived his own physical decline, and built a life that is larger than the game that saved him.